Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tale, a quick question. Do you dare wear the fear? Our exclusive Shadows merch is here. Hoodies, tees, and more, designed for those who embrace the darkness. Get yours before they vanish forever. Link below. The Dogman's Watch, a haunting in the woods. Day 1. The arrival. Ethan hadn't planned on feeling the weight of history when he arrived at the cabin. The long drive through the dense Michigan woods had been a quiet, uneventful journey, one that allowed his mind to wander into the peaceful silence. The forest stretched endlessly on either side of the dirt road, thick with trees that twisted and curled like ancient sentinels guarding forgotten secrets. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth, the promise of solitude tugging at him like a welcome friend. The cabin itself came into view just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a muted orange glow over the land. It was a small structure, one story, with a sagging roof and thick stone walls that were nearly lost beneath ivy and moss. A rusty old picket fence still clung to life around the perimeter, the paint long since peeled away, giving the place a feeling of abandonment, a place out of time. Ethan parked his truck beside the front steps, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. He stood for a moment, taking in the scene. There were no neighbors, no signs of life for miles in any direction. The wilderness had claimed the area, wrapping the cabin in an embrace of wild vines and overgrowth. It should have felt peaceful, calm, but instead there was an unease that settled over him like a weight. Something about the place felt old, almost as if it had been waiting. The air was still, and the wind had stopped for a moment. Everything was eerily quiet. He shook off the odd feeling and grabbed his bags from the truck, moving quickly to get inside. The wood of the front steps creaked beneath his boots as he ascended to the door. He unlocked it with the key he'd been given and stepped inside. The inside was exactly as he remembered. Dark wood paneling, the old stone fireplace on the far wall, a set of mismatched chairs near a small wooden table. The musty smell of neglect hung in the air, but it was a smell he could get used to. It was the kind of cabin you could easily imagine being haunted by ghosts of past lives, but for now, it would be his refuge. Ethan unpacked, setting up a fire in the hearth. The night had come quickly, and with it, the comforting crackle of the fire pushed back against the chill of the cabin. The firelight cast flickering shadows across the walls, making the room feel warmer, alive. It was peaceful, but still, a sense of unease lingered in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. As he settled into the armchair by the window, staring out into the deepening shadows of the forest, he felt something he couldn't explain, an awareness, a subtle but persistent feeling that something was there with him in the woods. He pushed the feeling aside and tried to focus on the silence, the kind of silence that only comes in places where no one has lived for years. It was the silence that swallows sound whole, leaving only the rustling of trees and the occasional call of an owl. Sleep came slowly, but eventually it took him. The last thing he remembered was the whisper of wind through the trees and the soft crackle of the fire. Day 2, the unsettling quiet. When Ethan awoke, the sun was high in the sky, slanting its pale light through the windows. The fire had burned low, and the cabin had returned to its quiet, stagnant state. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his back from the old chair, but a strange sense of restlessness nagged at him. It was a feeling he hadn't expected, considering the purpose of his trip. He was supposed to be unwinding, free from the noise and clutter of the city. But something about the cabin, or perhaps the forest itself, made it difficult to shake off the sensation of being watched. He decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. Stepping outside, he found himself swallowed by the forest. The trees were dense, towering above him in a quiet cathedral of green and brown, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The ground beneath his boots was soft with moss, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. As he walked, the silence pressed in on him, almost suffocating. There were no birds, no animals scurrying in the underbrush. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan continued, despite the odd feeling that clung to him. His mind wandered to the legends of the area. The stories he'd read online about strange sightings, cryptids, and things that didn't quite belong in the woods. The Michigan Dogman was one such legend, a creature said to appear every 10 years in the forests around the northern parts of the state. A 7-foot-tall bipedal creature with glowing eyes and the body of a man, but the face and mannerisms of a canine. The stories had intrigued him, but he dismissed them as local folklore, nothing more than exaggerated tales told by people who had too much time on their hands. As he walked deeper into the woods, the shadows grew longer and the silence grew thicker. Something felt wrong, as though the forest itself was watching him. He paused and listened, straining his ears for any sound, but there was nothing. The stillness was unsettling, unnatural. After a few hours, he made his way back to the cabin, his mind clouded with unease. The walk hadn't been calming. It had only deepened the sense of isolation that had begun to settle into his chest. He shook it off, convincing himself that it was simply the quiet of the wilderness playing tricks on him. He wasn't used to this kind of solitude, and the stories he had read were nothing more than that, stories. But even as he tried to settle in for the night, the air outside seemed to grow thicker. The wind had picked up again, rattling the trees, but it wasn't the sound of the wind that bothered him. It was something deeper, more primal, like the trees themselves were groaning under some unseen weight. His nerves were on edge, his skin tingling with an inexplicable awareness. He tried to sleep, but the unease gnawed at him. The silence felt too silent, and the wind whispered through the trees in a language he didn't understand. Day 3, the first encounter. By the third evening, the sense of wrongness had become too much to ignore. Ethan was sitting by the fire, the room dimly lit by the flickering flames, when he heard it, a soft, low growl. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. It was deeper, more guttural, and filled with a tension that made his spine straighten. His heart rate quickened, and for the first time since his arrival, he felt truly afraid. He stood up, straining to hear the sound again, but all he could hear was the crackle of the fire. The growl had stopped, but the air was thick with an unseen presence. It was as though something, or someone, was waiting just beyond the tree line, watching him, waiting for the right moment. A few moments later, the growl came again, louder this time. It was closer. It wasn't the growl of any animal he knew, not a bear or a wolf. It was too low, too unnatural. His hands trembled as he reached for the flashlight on the table, shining it toward the window. The beam swept across the dark forest, revealing only shadows and the skeletal shapes of the trees. But something in the woods shifted, and he swore he saw a shape, something tall and hunched, moving between the trees. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed that it was just a deer, a trick of the light, but deep down he knew. He knew it wasn't. The howling came next, a scream, like a human cry, twisted and distorted. It chilled him to the bone. The howl echoed through the forest, sending a wave of primal terror crashing over him. It felt like something ancient, something old and untouchable, was calling to him from the shadows. He stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature, whatever it was, had come closer. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. His body was frozen in place as he stared out into the woods, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. And then it did. The creature stepped into the light, no longer just a shape, but something solid, something real. It was tall, nearly 7 feet, with a hulking, muscular body that was both human and animal. Its head was that of a wolf, or something more feral, with sharp teeth bared in a snarl. Its eyes, those piercing amber eyes, locked onto his, filled with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. The air around him felt charged, like the very atmosphere had thickened. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stared, as if sizing him up, as if waiting for something. Ethan couldn't breathe. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. The creature took a slow step forward, its movements graceful and fluid despite its enormous size. The howl came again, softer this time, almost like a whisper. And then it spoke. Leave. The voice was low, guttural, and filled with an ancient power. Ethan's mind went blank. He wanted to scream, to flee, but he couldn't. The creature didn't move closer, but its presence pressed in on him like a heavy weight. It wasn't threatening him directly. It was simply there, watching, waiting, as if it knew that fear alone was enough to paralyze him. The creature's eyes never left his. It seemed to know him, as though it had been waiting for him specifically. And in that moment, Ethan realized something terrifying. This was no mere animal. It was something far older, something that had seen the world change, but had remained untouched by time. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally, the creature turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving only the faintest echo of its howl behind. Ethan stood frozen in place, the air around him heavy with a terror he couldn't shake. The woods were silent once more, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left him. Ethan barely slept that night. His mind was consumed with the encounter, the shape in the trees, the chilling howl, and the intelligence behind those amber eyes. He couldn't shake the image of the creature, standing there in the darkness, its body a terrifying blend of man and beast. As he lay in bed, his mind spun in circles, questioning everything he thought he knew about the world, about fear. The night stretched on, agonizingly slow. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside felt like a warning. He tried to convince himself it was just a bad dream, a figment of his overactive imagination, but the feeling of dread was undeniable. Something out there was watching him, waiting. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing. It wasn't just a story. When dawn finally broke, it brought little comfort. The pale light filtered through the thick trees, but the forest still felt oppressive, heavy with the lingering presence of the creature. Ethan knew he couldn't stay here much longer. He was supposed to feel safe in the wilderness, not trapped by something he didn't understand, but leaving didn't feel like an option. The isolation called to him, and yet it felt like a trap. Day 4, the second encounter. The day passed uneventfully. Ethan spent his time nervously pacing around the cabin, never straying too far from the immediate vicinity. He felt a pull to go back into the woods, to confront whatever it was that had come after him the night before, but he didn't trust himself. The forest felt like it was closing in on him, and each step he took seemed to carry him deeper into its grip. The evening came quietly, the wind picking up slightly, the branches of the trees creaking as though they were trying to speak. Ethan sat by the window, his eyes scanning the forest, his senses hyper-aware. There was a strange calmness about the woods tonight, too calm, as if they were holding their breath. The fire flickered and crackled, but it was distant, insignificant in the face of the growing tension. That's when he heard it again, the low growl. It was faint at first, just a ripple in the air, but as it grew louder, Ethan's stomach dropped. This wasn't the wind, not the rustle of branches or the murmur of nocturnal creatures. This was something else. Ethan slowly stood from his chair, his hand reaching for the flashlight. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, the cold sweat on his palms making the grip on the light unsteady. The growl came again, closer this time, a deep, guttural sound that rumbled through the walls of the cabin. He held his breath and listened, trying to quiet his racing thoughts. There was something else, something more sinister about the growl. It was too calculated, too aware. It wasn't just an animal sound. It was intelligent. Ethan stepped cautiously toward the door, peering out through the crack. The forest was dark, but he could make out a shadow moving in the distance. His breath caught in his throat when the shadow seemed to freeze, turning toward him. For a brief moment, he locked eyes with something not quite human, something that should not exist. The amber eyes gleamed like twin orbs of fire in the night, and the creature's growl turned into a soft, guttural chuckle, almost as if it was amused. The fear paralyzed him. Ethan stepped back from the door, his body shaking uncontrollably. He knew that what he had just seen was no animal, no bear or wolf. It was something older, something that existed in a place beyond his understanding. The Dogman. The howl came again, louder this time, shattering the silence of the night like a banshee's cry. But this time, the howl was accompanied by a different sound, something far more unnerving. The sound of feet, human-like, yet animalistic, scraping against the wooden porch. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood up. It was coming closer. Without thinking, he bolted for the back door. The flashlight bounced wildly in his hands as he ran out into the woods, away from the cabin, away from the thing that had been watching him. The trees closed in on him, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The moonlight barely filtered through the canopy, leaving him to navigate through the suffocating darkness. He ran, his breath ragged, but the sound of movement, those slow, deliberate steps, was still behind him. It was closing in, but there was something else in the air now, an unsettling feeling that he was being herded, that the creature was guiding him somewhere. The darkness of the woods seemed to shift around him, the trees almost pressing in, the ground uneven beneath his feet. It was as though the forest itself was conspiring with the creature, forcing him forward, cornering him in a space he couldn't escape. He stumbled, his heart pounding in his throat, and when he looked up again, the world seemed to tilt. He had entered a clearing, a small, forgotten space surrounded by towering trees, their trunks twisted and gnarled like ancient sentinels. The earth beneath his feet was soft, damp with the evening dew. And then, standing in the middle of the clearing, as though it had always been there, was the Dogman. It wasn't an appearance that happened suddenly. It was as if the creature had been waiting for him all along, patiently drawing him into this moment, this place. Ethan's body froze, his mind struggling to comprehend the reality of what he was seeing. The Dogman was towering over him, its amber eyes glowing in the low light, its massive, bipedal form casting a long shadow against the trees. It had been following him, yes, but now it was waiting. It wasn't moving, just standing there, its amber eyes fixed on him. It was the same creature from last night, larger than life in the moonlight, its massive frame silhouetted against the trees. Its posture was strange, almost relaxed, as though it was waiting for him to make the next move. Ethan's mind raced, but his body wouldn't respond. He stood there, paralyzed by the primal fear that seemed to emanate from the creature. The Dogman didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him with a quiet, unsettling patience. It was as if the creature was studying him, trying to understand him the way one might study an insect caught in a web. Ethan's pulse throbbed in his ears, and his thoughts spun in endless circles. It could kill him. It should have killed him already. But it didn't. Instead, the creature's lips curled back into a grin, a predator's grin, showing teeth that were far too sharp, far too large. And then, as if it had grown bored of him, it turned, moving away into the darkened trees without a sound. Its presence lingered, oppressive, suffocating. Ethan stood motionless, trembling, until the sounds of the forest slowly returned. The night resumed its quiet, but the feeling of being hunted never left. Day 5, the third encounter. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of the creature's presence, even as he sat by the fire the following evening. It was only midday when he made the decision to leave the cabin. But now, as the sun set and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor, something held him in place. He could feel it again. The weight of something unseen. This time, he wasn't alone in the cabin. He hadn't brought anyone with him, but the silence of the room was broken by a soft, creaking sound, like someone or something was moving around outside. Ethan's stomach clenched as he stood, heart racing, his hands cold. He grabbed the flashlight again, stepping cautiously to the window. He scanned the forest, his breath shallow, the shadows too long. And then, just as before, he saw it. The Dogman was standing at the edge of the trees, watching. This time, though, it wasn't just a fleeting shadow. It stepped forward, out into the open, and Ethan could see the full shape of it, the moonlight catching its eyes, its body like something made of nightmares. The creature tilted its head, as if acknowledging him, and then it did something that made Ethan's blood run cold. It whispered. The words were indistinct, too low to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. A dark, rumbling voice that carried with it an ancient malice. The words wrapped themselves around Ethan's heart, squeezing it in a vice. You belong here. The words struck him like a physical blow, and in that instant, Ethan felt a deep, gnawing certainty. This thing was not going to let him go. It didn't want to kill him, not yet. It wanted him to stay. It wanted him to become part of the land, part of the woods, just as it was. As it stepped forward again, Ethan realized with growing terror that he had become prey in a hunt that was not of his choosing. And once again, it was gone into the shadows, leaving him alone in the silence of the cabin, his heart thundering in his chest. Day 6, the final encounter. The morning came with a heavy, oppressive stillness. Ethan had spent the entire night watching the shadows, waiting for the moment when the creature would appear again, but it never came. The only sounds he could hear were the occasional creak of the cabin's wooden frame and the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. It was as if the forest itself had grown silent, holding its breath. He knew better than to believe it was over, but for the moment, he dared to hope. The sun climbed higher, but the unease gnawed at him. Even as he prepared to leave, to flee from the cabin and whatever had been stalking him, a deeper sense of inevitability washed over him. Something told him that the Dogman wasn't going to let him leave, at least, not without leaving a part of himself behind. The land had already claimed him in ways he couldn't quite explain, and leaving wasn't as simple as packing his things and walking away. He knew that the woods had become a part of him now, that what he had seen and heard would haunt him forever. As the sun dipped low in the sky and the shadows of the trees began to stretch, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He stood in the cabin, staring out the window, the air around him thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. His flashlight lay on the table, the beam of light an insignificant counter to the darkness encroaching outside. Then the howl split the silence. It was a cry like no other, a banshee-like wail that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the night. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, vibrating through the walls, through his chest, deep into his bones. It was raw, primal, and agonizing. A scream, human in tone but monstrous in power, echoing out across the trees. It was the Dogman's howl. Ethan's stomach twisted, and his blood ran cold. The howl stopped, leaving an eerie silence that seemed even more suffocating in its wake. He didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge it, but his feet carried him toward the door as if they were being controlled by something outside of his will. The forest waited, still and quiet, its shadows deepening under the last dying light of the sun. The Dogman was waiting. Ethan opened the door slowly, stepping out onto the porch, his eyes scanning the darkening woods. There, at the edge of the trees, stood the creature, its amber eyes glowing like two burning embers. This time it wasn't moving, didn't make a sound. It just watched him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There was no mistaking it. This was the moment. It wasn't coming for him. It was simply there, standing in the vast emptiness between man and beast. The creature's massive frame was a hulking silhouette against the fading light, its body neither entirely man nor animal, but something in between. A monstrosity that defied all logic and reason. The Dogman's head tilted ever so slightly, as if appraising him. Ethan felt his heart pounding, an ancient terror awakening inside him. It didn't need to approach, didn't need to roar or growl. It was enough that it existed, enough that it was real. And it knew he could never forget it. His voice trembled as he whispered into the stillness, why? The Dogman didn't respond. It didn't need to. The answer was in its eyes, the timeless, predatory understanding that Ethan was not in control. He was a guest here, and he would remain a guest forever. Then the creature did something that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It grinned. The kind of grin that could only be born from something ancient and hungry, something that had existed far longer than the human mind could comprehend. Its lips curled back, revealing rows of impossibly sharp teeth. And for a moment, just one fleeting moment, it seemed almost satisfied. Without a word, the Dogman turned, melting back into the trees, its massive form vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. Ethan stood there, frozen, as the last trace of the creature disappeared. The night around him was quiet again, the forest returning to its eerie, impenetrable calm. He stood motionless, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him like an invisible force. It was over, or so it seemed. He quickly turned and bolted back into the cabin, slamming the door behind him. His mind raced, but his body was exhausted, his limbs weak from the tension. The fire in the hearth had long since died, and now there was only cold silence. Ethan stood there in the dim, flickering light, knowing that something inside him had shifted. He could still feel it, feel the Dogman's presence lingering in the air, as if it had never truly left. No matter how far he went, no matter where he ran, the memory of those amber eyes would follow him. It wasn't a memory that could fade. It was an imprint, something that had burrowed deep into his soul, leaving behind a mark that would never be erased. With one last glance out the window, Ethan stepped away, his eyes never leaving the darkened line of trees. He gathered his things quickly, his hands shaking as he packed. But as he stepped outside, ready to leave for good, he felt it. The air was colder now, the shadows too long, the the wind too still, and the howl, faint and distant, whispered through the trees one last time, carrying with it a promise, a reminder that no matter where he went, it would always be watching, always waiting. Ethan didn't know if he would ever escape the Dogman, but he knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same. The forest had claimed him in ways he could never explain, and he would never be free of its shadow. And that, in itself, was enough to make him wonder if he was being followed even now. You made it back for now, but the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video, subscribe, but know this: some doors once opened do not close so easily.